Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for the next installment in Grinsabach Lear & Associates webinar series, Leveraging Stewardship to Enhance Donor Loyalty. Today's session is our most highly attended webinar to date, and we have drawn in participants from across the globe representing virtually every sector of the nonprofit industry. Our session today is co-presented by Eloise Sturr, GG&A Vice President and Managing Director, and Mary Carol Stark, GG&A Consulting Vice President. Eloise joined the firm in 2008 and brings more than 30 years fundraising experience with public and private educational institutions. Prior to her role at GG&A, she served as the Associate Vice Chancellor for University Development and Alumni Relations at Vanderbilt University, where she helped guide the university's $1.75 billion Shape the Future campaign. Mary Carol joined GG&A in 2004 and brings broad experience in IT systems and advancement services. Mary Carol also serves as the Director of Development for Campaign Operations at Vassar College, and her role includes managing donor relations, prospect research, programming, reporting, technology, and support staff. In today's session, Eloise and Mary Carol will discuss ways to steward donors beyond acknowledgments and receipts and further maintain focus on the individual, not just the gift. They will also discuss the role of donor relations and stewardship departments as well as the role of advancement staff in stewarding donors. Lastly, they will discuss stewardship surveys as a tool for analyzing and identifying the donor experience of your program. A question and answer session will take place after today's presentation. Please use the chat function in the right-hand side of your screen, select all participants from the drop-down menu, and send Eloise and Mary Carol your questions. Please feel free to keep your chat up throughout the presentation and share your thoughts and questions with fellow attendees. This coming Monday, I will be sending a recording of today's session along with the presentation slides and a short survey to gain your feedback. Thank you all again for joining us today, and now I'll turn it over to Eloise to get us started.
Thanks, Stephanie, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. I hope everybody is keeping cool or staying out of the thunderstorms. As Stephanie said, in the hour that we have, we're going to cover best practices and also the structural elements of a stewardship program. We're going to walk through some case studies, and we're going to offer some practical suggestions on ways to test and expand your programs. As Stephanie mentioned, on the line, we have a wide variety of institutions and nonprofits, and we're very pleased to have all of you, and we hope that from this you can gain specific suggestions that will help you in your work. Stephanie, I'm not able to move my...
Okay, Eloise, you should have controls on the screen and be able to use your arrow keys.
My arrow key is not working, so maybe you can...
I'm going to pass it over to me and I'll give it a try.
Okay.
That'd be great. Mary Carol, after all, is the technical expert.
Okay, Mary Carol.
So let me just, if I may, just go ahead and start through here while Mary Carol brings up the slides. So more specifically, we will state the obvious. It's not just a matter of thank you letter and gift receiving that comprises donor stewardship, but what is it? We will talk about the relationship cycle. That is, it's not just the gift. And we're going to cover what we think donor relations and stewardship staff should lead and do, and more generally, what the advancement staff should do. As I mentioned, we'll have a few examples of solid stewardship programs, case studies, and we will talk about stewardship surveys as tools for analyzing and identifying the donor experience of your program.
Okay, Stephanie, so much for the technical expertise here. I can't seem to make it work either.
So while we do that, if you may, since you'll see the slides later, I'm just going to talk through some of what you would see if we didn't have these technical problems. So donor stewardship is about the institution's ongoing relationship with the donor. but clearly that could be infinite. So let's frame our expectations. That's what we hope to do today, as well as those of the donor. You need to fulfill specific obligations established as part of the gift agreement, and this is pretty important, we think. That is the gift agreement. A lot of things go wrong in this realm, so please don't overlook your gift agreements. Take them seriously, which I'm sure you all do, but also look to see whether or not they're user-friendly. Are they inspiring? Does it tell the story of why the donor made the gift? Stewardship should strengthen the relationship between the donor and the institution. It is absolutely critical for the ongoing relationship. Stewardship reports should build the donor's confidence in the institution's ability to manage gifts well. And the best stewardship programs certainly broaden points of contact between the donor and the institution. It's not just about you and the donor, it's about the institution and the donor ultimately. That carries forth as there are staff transitions, as there are leadership transitions. The donor is the one constant in that, as is the institution, and we want to make sure that what we build frames a very strong relationship between those two. And clearly, stewardship done well helps prepare donors for future solicitations. It's not exactly that the best stewardship makes the next ask automatic, but it certainly makes it a whole lot easier. Stewardship best practices. You need to be very strategic and specific about your stewardship process. We believe that you need a strategic approach to stewardship to provide a framework for the process. And one litmus test is, can a new development officer read or find on your intranet what the stewardship process at your institution is? Is that really clear? And if it's not, it's a problem. It needs to be written down. It needs to be available for newcomers and for our partners in all of this, which can be physicians, it can be deans, it can be faculty, it can be CEOs of nonprofits. You need a professionally organized and managed program with staff resources dedicated to the stewardship process. This is probably obvious to all of you. Many of you are in those roles, but this is an area that in development has traditionally been underfunded. We saw that for decades, and very pleased to see that a number of places really take this very seriously now, and certainly all of you do by your commitment to be part of this webinar. You need to work with all staff to make sure that everyone understands that every contact with the donor is stewardship. Fundraising clearly is a team sport. Reminding everyone that every donor contact should be stewardship is just absolutely critical, done in a way that is that just becomes automatic and not annoying for people. And you need to integrate fundraising, finance, and financial data for accurate reporting. This is often the first and biggest challenges for institutions that are setting up new stewardship programs. Seems like it would be easy, but almost everywhere the fundraising accounting is different from the finance accounting, and so you need to make those two merge. There are obviously legal and auditing separations for that data. Financial aid data is particularly sensitive for institutions. There's lots of regulation and law around that. So getting this right, getting the processes so it's not a major project every year as you do stewardship reports is absolutely critical. So we understand that, and we really appreciate all your work on that. So Mary Carol, can you talk a little bit about what we mean by separating acknowledgments from receiving?
Sure. Thanks, Eloise. Thanks, everyone, for attending. First of all, I want to thank two individuals who took the time to speak with me prior to the presentation for some of our case studies, and that's Diane Wilder at Haverford and Janet Fertella at Oregon Health and Science University Foundation. So thanks very much to both of you for helping in this process. I won't take a lot of time on this piece of it, but I think that one of the things we see with our clients and see with colleagues is that there is often not a separation of acknowledgments and receipting, and so I want to talk a little bit about why today, why that's so important. Receipting is for IRS purposes. Acknowledgments are for stewardship purposes. Often, advancement offices, we see these terms are interchangeable, where receipts are often part of acknowledgment letters when they really shouldn't be, particularly in cases where receipts, that receipt acknowledgement letter is traveling around the office to be signed by any number of people or one person, and that person is out of the office on vacation for 2 weeks. And so the actual receipt and acknowledgement end up being late. Receipts should be sent out within 24 to 48 hours of the gift entry. So the key to that is that the donor knows that we received the check and all is well, and we've processed everything, and then we can use the acknowledgement process to recognize the donor at the particular gift level and that kind of thing. So work on keeping the receipting in the hands of the gift recorders and the acknowledgement in the hands of the donor relations staff. Establish an acknowledgement process that suits the culture of the institution and meets the needs of the donors is key. So we all can't do this the same way because we all don't have the same donors and we all don't have the same amount of staff or technology and those kinds of things. So, acknowledgments can take various forms. You can have acknowledgments that if you have giving societies, for instance, do you acknowledge giving societies? Do you acknowledge first-time donors? Do you acknowledge at the time of a pledge or at the completion of a pledge? Who signs the letter and at what level? We'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation, sort of that matrix that you can put together. But there are various ways that you can do the acknowledgments. Acknowledgments can be done, there's a difference between standardization and personalization versus customization. So for instance, standardization, you should have a series of standard letters that you use. For instance, at Vassar we have 44 standard letters that we use. Those letters are then personalized using the technology and the database and reporting and those kinds of things we sort through the data. We pull out those that can be standardized, we personalize those, and then we also have ways of identifying those that need to be customized. So those where, the president may have seen this person in the last week or two, or they've attended an event, or, something else, we know something else about that individual that we want to customize the letter to define. And so that can be done in that process. The key is to keep the acknowledgments timely. So even when you're customizing, they still need to be done timely. So it's a matter of sort of organizing yourself in such a way that you're using the technology to get the bulk of the standard letters out, and then taking the time to work on the customized letters. A case in point on this is Oregon Health and Science University Foundation. They are in the process of separating receipting and acknowledgments. They use Blackbaud's the Razor's Edge as their database, and they're using fields within the database to help them develop the process that they need in order to be able to separate this process out. So the goal is for the receipt to go out immediately, but then a 3 to 5 day turnaround time for the acknowledgments. They're looking at this from the donor's perspective and understanding that the donor not only wants to know that we received the check, but also thanking them for their gift and the specifics of their gift. This was a project that they took on it's about a 6-month project. They took it on in March of 2010. The first part of the project that was helpful to them was that they did a GG&A gift processing review. So one of my colleagues came in and did a complete review of gift processing to be able to establish if there were efficiencies that were needed there, and more data that needed to be added to the database during that process in order to make this process work more efficiently and effectively. And so they had, we delivered that report. They had internal discussions. They created reports. They did training, and they'll be completed with that by August 2010. So going beyond the receipts and the acknowledgments, other things that these are all areas that those of us who have been in donor relations know and stewardship know that these are the kinds of things that we need to do on a regular basis and establish protocols for. So I won't touch on every one of these at this moment extensively, because this is sort of what we're going to be talking about throughout the presentation. But things like thankathons, these are using student phoners or staff or volunteers is always a nice touch to donors rather than just calling them, asking for money. Call as well and thank them for money. Things like the in memory of and in honor of gift processes. The key to these are good data in the database and data that's standardized, making sure you have next of kin addresses in the database. Other things, making sure that your gift recorders are entering who the gift is in memory of and creating those processes and keeping those in place. Donor recognition and recognition societies, donor recognition, things like plaques, putting things on websites, stewarding donors in that respect, recognition societies, lots of options available for that, which we'll talk a little bit about a little bit later. But again, the recognition societies is definitely a key part of fundraising. So they can be motivators, they can be indicators of future giving. So these are important aspects of our overall process that we need to make sure we take into consideration when we're stewarding donors. Annual reports, report of gifts, neither of these to be taken lightly. They're usually, they can be expensive, but they need to be thought through. The annual reports sometimes, which are the financial part, are sometimes embedded within reports of gifts, which are the donor honor roll. So I'm sure you are all, like I am, having these discussions on an annual basis on what to include, whether or not to do them, how to do them, how much money to spend, that kind of thing. But these are important discussions to have from a stewardship perspective because you have to look at it from the eyes of the donor. Fund reports and impact reports, we'll talk more about that later. Capital project reports, these are, making decisions about whether or not you send the report at the beginning of the project, in the middle of the project, at the end of the project, and then we often find, whether or not you keep sending capital projects reports after the project is finished, but then focus on the programmatic piece of, what's happening in that building. Is it for a specific function and those kinds of things. So thinking through that. High-level contact when, where, how to use the president, the chancellor, deans, CEOs of organizations, those kinds of things. So making sure that you're talking amongst yourselves about how that happens. Ad hoc communications. This is what happens here is when people really need to know what's happening at the institution. This is the kind of thing that, it can be, a one-on-one or a group of people might receive, say, information about something that's happening at the business school because someone was just hired. That would be important to know about, or the president was just quoted in a specific magazine or newspaper, those kinds of things. And then the things we all do, which are the recognition type events. Eloise, over to you.
Let's switch gears for just a minute here and talking about what the donor wants. I put these into really 4 categories in terms of stewardship. The donor wants context for his or her giving, impact, wants some compassion, that is the kid gloves, and wants some public recognition. Probably not universally true, but essentially I think those are the categories. So what do I mean by these? Context. How the philanthropy fits with the institutional operating statement and purpose. How is this important? Context for the gift, not only when it was made, but also now. Impact, close cousin, that is how the gift has helped the organization move forward, the institution. Has it helped with faculty, rankings, performance, you name it. But impact to the gift and being realistic about that and not just being generic, really being specific where that's possible. The third category of sort of compassion, those are the personal letters, the personalized acknowledgement, kid gloves, the things that don't look formulaic or financial, don't look like they just came out of the auditing office, but rather are the ways in which this has really touched people. And then the fourth category of public recognition, which Mary Carol just touched a little bit on, honor rolls or annual reports. That's an example of what can be done in terms of public recognition. There obviously are ways in which they're donor walls. There are certainly naming on buildings, et cetera. But donors do want some public recognition. We're seeing with a lot of clients that there's a discussion about whether or not it's just smarter now to have honor rolls on the web. And I think that needs to be, as Mary Carol suggested, very carefully considered to know whether or not that fits your population. Are they going to go to the web? Does it have the same impact? Are they going to really believe that the institution appreciated the gift if it's just on a website somewhere? And then, of course, also just the donor's confidentiality. They want public recognition, but what does that mean? Does it mean for anybody who's searching the web, or does it mean within the constituency, or in the case of the university, the alumni base? So we've included here a sample chart. Again, Mary Carol referenced this a little bit in terms of a matrix. Getting organized. Stewardship is, as I said at the beginning, is almost an infinite process. There are just way too many more good suggestions than there are hours in the day and number of staff. And so setting this up in a way that you can decide who gets what, and you can also make sure that your deans, your physicians, your development officers, your chief volunteers all understand what the categories are and just what's possible. This can get pretty complicated. Mary Carol mentioned the 44 letters, different letters at Vassar. So you'll figure out the way to do this, but this is a great way, and I think it's sort of a general way to organize who's doing what, what's going to be done for donors at various levels, and also with what kind of frequency.
So some examples of effective donor relations, we've touched on these, but the stewardship reports. I think the key to the stewardship or the impact, the fund reports, is that they require accurate financial data and then also a programmatic piece. So there's got to be, it has to be informative as well as accurate, the financial data must be accurate. It can, if it's a scholarship, it can include a statement from the recipients. If it's a faculty chair, the letter actually might come from the dean, the report might come from the dean or the person sitting in the chair. So these fund reports, stewardship reports, impact reports, whatever you call them at your institution, are very important to the donor because it really does give them a sense of how their money is being used. They don't need to be flashy, but they need to be nicely done with good, strong content that really, like I said, tells the donor how the money is being used. I've seen this done at some institutions where pieces of this can be automated. In other words, places where they have they're highly integrated with their financial data and other data that would be needed for to put in the market value, the principal, what's been spent, all of that information on the financial side, where they can. Obviously, the programmatic piece can't be automated, but if you're looking at relooking at the way you do this, that might be one thing to look at to see if you can improve on that. But the automation also requires good, accurate data within your database. Gift clubs, again, used much for motivators and as indicators of future giving patterns. Lots of ways you can do giving clubs, consecutive giving, cumulative giving, lifetime giving, all these kinds of ways that you can break down the data, keeping in mind that again, it all requires accurate data. So for instance, and it actually requires really good programming to make these really work well, so that your algorithms behind the scenes to determine whether or not someone is a consecutive or a consistent donor is taken seriously, because you might have someone who has given five times in the last 4 years. In their eyes, they're a 5-year donor. So you have to take that into account in your programming, because they may have given twice in the same fiscal year, but they don't know that. That's our problem, not theirs. So really having IT staff who can help you with those kinds of algorithms to create the giving clubs that make sense for your institution and that really put people in the right categories. Things like birthday or Thanksgiving cards are really, these are nice touches, just like the thank-a-thons. These are things that really mean a lot to donors. Trying to determine whether or not you can information that it can be sent out by the president or the dean in a semi-annual letter, or those kinds of things, to those kinds of touches that are really important to the donor. A lot of times when they're not expected, which even means more to the donors. And then being invited to things like galas or recognition events and those kinds of things. A really good example of a case study for this is, especially for stewardship reports, is Haverford College, a small liberal arts institution. I think that at this point there's one person, the director of stewardship. I think I can't remember if there's an assistant or not, but anyway, she has very, very strong relationships with people on campus, the provost office, the business office, financial aid, and the reporting that they do on the various centers around campus. That relationship really makes the fund reporting very, very content-driven and very timely. So she has a lot of longevity at the institution, which I think helps, but the communication is what is key to this. She, not only talks to them when she needs the information, but she also has regular communication throughout the year with these departments. They might have lunch together, they might do some, but they're in contact with each other, so they know. So she knows what's happening throughout campus. The other part that really makes this work is that they have a very strong commitment to systems integration. They are all on different databases. The advancement office is on Razor's Edge. I'm not sure what the other areas use, but the technology infrastructure is in place to really make this process efficient. So let's talk for a couple minutes about the role of donor relations in this whole process. Just a quick review sort of the organizational structure. So number of staff. We all know that this really kind of depends on the prospect pool, the donor pool, and the commitment of the institution. Sort of where does stewardship fit into the overall plan? At Vassar, we grew from one administrator and one assistant in the early 1990s. Then we went to 2 administrators and 1 assistant. Now we have 3 administrators and assistant. When that 3rd administrator was just added in the last 5 to 6 years, which to me shows the commitment to the institution to stewardship and donor relations. So when you think about this, you also think about where does donor relations report. I've seen this report through various areas, whether it's operations or advancement services, communications, major gifts. At some larger institutions, there are also vice president of donor relations positions, which I think is wonderful. There's really no right or wrong way to do this. It's just a matter of taking a look at the institution and seeing what makes sense. The key to this is that wherever that operation, the donor relations stewardship operation sits, that they are integrated into the bigger picture of the institution. They also, in terms of this, they also have donor relations staff also has responsibility above and beyond sort of big acknowledgments and fund reports, which tend to be the key things that people focus on. Eloise touched on gift agreements, endowment agreements. Your donor relations staff should be key players in that process. They should be assisting in gift and naming opportunities. They're always the people that say they're sorry, that we're sorry on the few occasions that we need it, that where we made a mistake, we need to rely on them to help us through that process. But they really should be involved in more of an integrated approach. Expectations of the donor relations staff pretty straightforward in terms of what they're required to do, which is to record data in the primary database, retrieve data from the primary database for reporting, develop strong working relationships with departments within the advancement operation, so whether that's the annual fund so that they're clear on what the giving societies are or major principal gifts, to make sure that they know what solicitations are in the pipeline, what endowment agreements might be coming through, these kinds of things. Very critical to have a strong working relationship, particularly within the communications office. For instance, at Vassar, we meet with the donor relations meets with communications on a monthly basis to make sure that, to see if there's things that we can piggyback on that are broad broad communications that are going out, those kinds of things. And as in the example of Haverford, it's very important to develop relationships with the staff within the institution, provost office, dean's office, financial aid office, those kinds of things. As I always point out, working with on the web and stewardship on the web, trying to figure out ways to manage that process, keeping the confidentiality of the donors, or getting agreement from the donors to be able to be, a story to be told on the web about them and their giving to the institution, and then developing an overall stewardship strategy that's for all levels of donors and potential donors. Knowing what reports are sent, when they're sent, who they're sent to, and all of that infrastructure. Some things to think about for ways that we've seen stewardship work and that stewardship will work. Documenting a plan at the time of every major gift commitment. Things like, for instance, if say someone gives X amount of dollars for maybe a general construction purposes, they're not wedded to one project, but they want the institution or the organization to spend money where they best see fit. It's very important to make sure you have a plan in place to steward that donor, because that's information that can easily get lost. So you need communication with either the budget office on how the money is supposed to be spent, or the finance office on how the money was spent. Keeping those lines of communication open is really important. You can also, ways to do this would be to develop a program that takes advantage of opportunities. Somebody, is a big football fan, so invite them to home games, these kinds of things. New dean in the medical school, so appointing, a new dean's been appointed, so find a way to take advantage of that to alert or to steward donors and send that information to them, or to invite them to the first lecture or something that that particular person is giving. As you do this, it's always good to also create a central system to monitor the stewardship. And so we've talked about this several times now, where I keep mentioning the database. And so finding ways within your system to monitor and support stewardship activities. And then lastly, what's very key to this is that the stewardship staff have the authority to implement the plan. And I think what's key to that is going back to what we were talking about in terms of having the stewardship staff be integrated into the larger picture. That makes it much easier to give them the ability to do that. Excuse me. In general, we have to make sure that stewardship is not an afterthought. So again, back to that, it needs to be an integral part of the overall fundraising plan and the overall fundraising structure. One way to help this would be to develop some criteria for evaluating your fundraisers on the role they play in this process. Are they making stewardship calls? Do they have a certain portion of their prospect pool within stewardship? Looking at that data to make sure that they're actually assisting in the stewardship process. And then we want to make sure we create an appropriate balance between what the donors' right to know and the institution's fiduciary responsibilities are, making sure that, again, we're keeping the donors informed to the extent that they need to know what the impact of their gift is doing, but we keep the institution in mind as well as we do this. And it's really important, I think, to create a process to prompt yourself and staff members to know when these communications need to happen. I've seen things like email alerts that are triggered off of pieces of data in the database. For instance, if someone becomes a new trustee at a large foundation, things like this. So gift activity reports, having regular stewardship meetings. Like I said, we have a stewardship committee at Vassar that meets monthly or every other month, just to talk about our activities and to see if there's anything specific we need to be doing with specific groups of donors. and to touch on a little bit, Eloise talked about this in the beginning, that stewardship is everyone's job, the role, the expectations of the advancement staff. So stewardship is everyone's job, and so staff at all levels need to understand this. It sounds simple and sounds common sense, but we actually talk about this at our first full staff meeting at the beginning of the year to make sure, everybody from the person answering the 800 line to the phone-a-thon callers, everyone needs to understand and embrace this concept. People, don't want to be, transferred to 10 different people before their call is taken. It's they consider their time valuable, and we need to respect that and take a message rather than transferring somebody 10 different times. So things like that, just some common sense things to remind people about. What's key to this too is that the advancement staff in general need to make sure that they record the data they need to record in the primary database. So for instance, personal salutations for the different staff members, they know whether or not, they're the ones who will know whether or not it's, Susie or Buffy, how the president addresses this person. So making sure that they take that responsibility seriously, and then entering their contacts as well with the donors. And then because they need to understand that we need to share this information with each other for the long-term relationship of the donor and the prospect with the institution. As Eloise talked about in the beginning, that's what it's all about, is that relationship.
So in the few minutes that we have left, we want to focus on stewarding the individual, not just the gift. We're going to talk about the stewardship plan, what that means, stewardship report, what to include, stewardship visit, what to do before the visit, stewardship volunteer committee, whether or not that might make sense for you, and stewardship surveys. Again, does this make sense for you? So let's start with stewardship plan. Mary Carol, do you want to talk about that?
Sure. Since we're getting short on time, so I don't want to dwell on this, but the idea would be to develop a plan for just a handful of donors. If you haven't done this before, it's important to start small so you don't overwhelm yourself, because the idea is to really personalize these, develop a stewardship communications plan for each for these donors. And they might be former trustees, people who are somehow on the periphery, that you don't touch all the time, significant donors to the campaign, these kinds of things. So what it requires is a great deal of personalization and individual staff time. So because there might be staffing issues, you want to make sure that you start small and you're realistic about what you can accomplish with this. Because what you need to do is make sure that it doesn't happen in a vacuum within donor relations and stewardship. Include your prospect managers and anybody else involved in that process. You can use the database to store and retrieve the information that you need, interest giving patterns, these kinds of things. A colleague of mine at GGNA just informed me that the Razor's Edge has a module that could be used to really help in this process to organize this kind of data. So you want to really make and create realistic expectations for yourselves so that you don't bite off more than you can chew at that point if you're first trying to implement something like this. In terms of the implementation, then you want to just regularly review the plan with everyone involved, so the prospect managers within donor relation, find ways to document tasks that have been completed, do things like, create a matrix or, keep the data in the database, because you really want to keep a history of what's been completed and how that donor's been touched over time, because that's very important for the donor institution relationship. Okay, go ahead.
I'm going to talk about stewardship report, obviously a subset of the stewardship plan. And by stewardship report, what I really mean is an annual description of financial and other impacts of giving for the donor. Each one can take a half day to a day to complete. Many of you who are listening, I probably might say it might take even more, but my main point in saying that is this takes time. So job number one is to figure out how many funds you have, how many endowed funds you have, and do some sort of arithmetic in terms of what resources do you have, and thus what do you have available in order to do stewardship reports. And obviously, some should get perhaps very detailed stewardship reports. Those who are principal gift donors are going to get different stewardship reports than those who have given at lower levels and perhaps aren't as likely to give again. And we talked before about whether or not you include donors to capital projects. This is, I think, an area where you can have great impact if resources allow to give building fund donors annual stewardship reports, and they get a sense of what programs are possible because of the building project. And you want to build in a way to encourage those who get the reports to give more. And how do you do that? In the stewardship report, you need to make the information come alive. This is not the time to convey only dry financial data. Stories are great. Being very creative about the ways in which this gift has had impact really can work. And the annual stewardship reports we know are read by donors, so you have a ready audience there. As you begin to prepare a stewardship report, you want to go through these steps for your model. For those of you who have not been doing stewardship report, you want to identify past gifts and purposes. Maybe you want to call it lifetime giving and financial impact. Maybe you want to do a pie chart of their gift allocations over time to give them a sense. It's surprising sometimes that donors forget where they've given money, forget the proportions. And of course, ironically, some of that is because some gifts have much greater impact than others. But it's worthwhile doing a pie chart, again, or some version of that in order to let them know just what they have done. You want to tell the story of why their investment has made a difference through the impact. You want to be specific as well as lofty, perhaps, as you tell stories about the impact of their gift to individuals who are the beneficiaries. And again, aligning impact with the original purpose of the gift. Look at the gift agreement before you do the stewardship report. Make sure that your spenders have not gotten out of line with the donor's original intent or, in fact, the gift agreement. We all know that can happen with staff transition with gifts that are 20 years old or sometimes even more recent. Think about who should get this stewardship report from the family. I see clients that still only write to the husband because the husband was the one who signed the check when the gift was made 15 years ago, but should it be to a couple if the person is married? What about kids? That's not appropriate everywhere, but think that through as you come up with your architecture for stewardship reports. While you're at it, you probably want a bigger audience for your stewardship report than just one person. And identifying sustaining benefits, that's just that's in the category of, as you're making this interesting and enticing, talking about how this has an impact for the future. You don't have a crystal ball, but you can think about the ways in which you can project that their gift is going to have an importance into the future. So let's talk about stewardship visit. By this, we mean that you are, the purpose of your meeting is to tell the donor how important the gift was that was made, or gifts. And sometimes it's delivering the stewardship report with the visit, but not always. But what I want to emphasize here is just the importance of the homework that needs to be done before then. And because often this is with a volunteer or an administrator, someone who wasn't necessarily involved in the gift itself. So I just want to emphasize again here, look at past giving, really understand this person, look at past designations, read the gift agreement, look at the stewardship report that have been given to the donor in the last few years. They're going to remember that information. And you also, of course, just like any development visit, you want to identify the critical issues for this donor before the visit happens. So that's the briefing. Whoever's going on the stewardship meeting should make sure that person is well briefed. Often, again, this is taken a little bit lightly because you're not actually asking, but of course what you're doing is setting up perhaps for a future ask. So in the stewardship visit, you need to think about the setting. You really can't overthink this, in my opinion. I think dress rehearsals are useful, especially if you're taking, again, someone who's not been involved in the securing of the gift, and talk about who's doing what are the roles, what are the key messages, what are you trying to do, what are you going to leave behind, what's the nature of this donor, how long should the visit be, and of course, importantly, what is the desired outcome. So again, it's just good development work, but we emphasize it here because we see that stewardship visits often are not taken with the same level of seriousness that a solicitation visit is taken. Carol, do you want to talk a little bit about where stewardship volunteer committees work and don't work?
Sure.
How they work?
I think that the key to this is to look at your own volunteer structure and see if this fits. I don't think that it fits for everyone. It's not something that can be should or can be taken lightly. I think if you develop an idea for a stewardship volunteer committee, I think it's helpful because there are a lot of ways that it helps in the overall process. You have timely and accurate processing of gifts. They can help with routine reporting to donors on gifts from that they can go, like as Eloise said, they can be part of a stewardship visit to help with this kind of thing. They can help sign letters of appreciation to the donors and acknowledgments, these kinds of things. So I think that having this kind of committee is something that is individual to the institution or organization and needs to be looked at over time. And the Oregon Health and Science University Foundation right now is in the process of building a volunteer network to assist in stewardship. So I think that they're really working hard at having the volunteers help to make thank you calls, developing as part of the matrix we talked about earlier, in inserting the volunteer structure into that process and where it identifies by gift level. They're using a lot of technology to help support this function, and they really feel strongly that it means a great deal to the donors when they're acknowledged by their peers and not just by the institution. And they're hoping in the future to grow this volunteer group regionally.
Some of our clients have used stewardship surveys to really understand the effectiveness of their program. In the case of Penn State and Ohio State, they have very strong established stewardship programs, but they wanted to understand what's working, what's needed, what's really having impact. So stewardship surveys are a tool for analyzing. You have to be ready to hear the good and the bad. You want to hear what donors are really thinking. You want to move beyond the donors just assuming that the donors are going to be happy because they're sending them information. It also will tell you what their present level of engagement is. It's just good development work. You get donors to take a moment to think about what they've done, and they will most often remind themselves of how glad they are they invested in your institution, your school, your hospital, your university. We find that stewardship surveys are a way to get information from a broad population. Individual one-on-one calls are quite expensive. These stewardship surveys can be done in a variety of manners. Some are done in person by the development officers. We have clients that have mailed surveys. We have had great success with web-based surveys. You're probably seeing some of that being done internally in your organization, done with with outside constituencies. You can learn a lot and use stewardship surveys. And both involving volunteers with development officers on calls, that has worked. It is a scheduling challenge, I think we find, but where we have been able to convince people to use that, it has worked very well because the volunteers hear what the donors are thinking about the effectiveness of stewardship and the impact on their gifts. So again, in-person, web, and mail surveys, and then sometimes thinking carefully about who's going to deliver the surveys other than just the development officers alone is important.
Great, Eloise, I'm going to jump in real quick. We have about 10 minutes remaining in today's session, so I'm going to go ahead and ask the audience to start sending their questions in as we finish up the remaining slides.
So before you create the survey, we've just got a couple bullet points here that relate to doing your homework, Not to suggest that any of you wouldn't, but again, this is in the category of a number of things we've said. That is, don't take this lightly, get all the facts in place and know just what the donors have gotten before you, and understanding all that before the survey goes out. When you create the survey, you will want, if you're not professional survey developers, you will want some assistance in figuring out just what questions people can answer and are not ambiguous. There is a science to doing that. You want to make most of the answers multiple choice, but we would encourage you not to do that exclusively, that you should have 2 or 3 open-ended questions so that you get the donors talking. They're going to often, if you do it all multiple choice, you're also going to see it as a test, and that's not what you want. You want them to be relaxed and to give you the information that they are truly believe. Testing the survey, probably very obvious, but don't forget to do that before you implement it with a larger group. So we have a couple of sample questions that we've included here just to give you a flavor of the kind of thing that we're talking about. What was the key motivating factor for making your gift? Who was most influential? To what extent is the institution using the gift in the manner in which you intended? And has your gift had the kind of impact you originally envisioned? There might be questions about how this compares with other philanthropic investments they've made, whether or not your institution is stewarding as well. So usually we think should be limited to 20, 25 questions. Again, not all multiple choice, but you don't want to make everyone open-ended or it gets to be a little bit difficult to compile the information in the end. So when you're done with it, you need to just allow enough time for a thorough analysis of the study data. This information is a treasure. Make sure you have experienced people interpreting the data and quantifying and qualifying it. Thinking about who should get the results. Should it be your board, the president, all development staff, physicians, faculty, different reports to each. Know that in advance. And including the recommendations for its most effectively using the results. This is key. How do you put this information to work? So creating a set of recommendations and timeline for the appropriate audiences. If we have the time, we'll just go through. Wanted to end on a bit of a fun note, common mistakes. Perhaps I have this section because I've maybe made all of them. But in any case, if I haven't made them, I think I've seen them. That is, sending the stewardship report to donors without copying the people who the donor knows best. So, of course, what you get is the donor calls the person they know well and says, what does this mean? I don't understand this financial information. And that person has to say, well, I haven't seen it. So not a good thing. That's a mistake. Not having clear gift club accounting rules makes people mad. They are confused. They don't want to participate. Mistakes in the annual report, check, but there are going to be cases, so don't forget the disclaimer. Another common mistake is generic prose in the stewardship report or stewardship letter. It's done on schedule, but it's just boring, and the financial information isn't entirely clear. They group recognition events that seem to be convenient for the development office or maybe for the dean or for the chief administrator, but really don't take into account what's going to make a good stewardship plan or help individuals. Tchotchkes that are just on automatic pilot really don't work anymore. That's just a mistake. In some ways, it's a difficult area anyway. It's a no-win because people have strong opinions about whether or not they should get the tchotchkes. This revolving door, letters from junior staff who are ambitious and really want to make a difference, and we love that, but the donor doesn't know them. And so the stewardship letters should really come from the people who the donors trust. And stewardship programs that are so segregated, particularly within the multi-universities, where it's only about a donor's one interest when in fact the donor has a multiplicity of interests. So again, thanks. I think that we're probably to the point where we need to address questions. Is that right, Stephanie?
Absolutely. We're going to go ahead and just jump right into some questions that we've received. Any questions that we don't get to in today's time, we will be sending out an email in the coming weeks addressing some of the answers to your questions. I'll throw this out to both of you, and you guys can decide who wants to field this question. When in the prospect cultivation and solicitation process, should the donor relations and stewardship staff be brought into the process?
Want to take it, Carol?
In my opinion, yes, because I supervise donor relations. I think that it depends on where. I mean, we've talked about possibly having the donor relations staff have individual relationships with the leadership gift officers for that, simply for that purpose. So if and when they can be brought into these discussions, I think early on, especially when writing endowment agreements and those kinds of things, I think is beneficial.
Great, thank you, Eloise. How much time do you think that stewardship gets blurred with ramping up for the next gift? Can you speak to that whole issue?
I'll jump in here. I think it's pretty common, and that's both completely understandable in that it is we like donors to be on the continuum of stewardship moving into the next gift. But part of it is being very clear, again, going back to making sure that we understand what each visit, what each call, what each contact is trying to accomplish. Because it's ultimately bad and irritating to the donors if every thank you includes an ask or seemingly includes an ask. So be clear, make sure there are lots of unequivocal thank yous / stewardship, and then when possible, move into areas of moving to the next ask. But be clear with the donors when that time is to say, are you ready to talk about your next investment or your next gift?
Great, thanks, Eloise. How do you recommend the stewardship staff manage and monitor the stewardship activity planned and completed? Are you using any metrics to measure activity of your staff and development officers?
We have metrics in place for the development officers of Vassar, and I know that many of our clients have metrics in place for development officers. We're not seeing it as much from a donor relations standpoint. We do monitor the number of reports that we send, how many acknowledgement letters we're customizing versus standardizing to monitor those efficiencies. We're looking at endowed fund agreements. We're tracking those in the database now so everyone can see those. So various ways that we have to measure that. Eloise, I don't know if you have clients that are doing that differently.
It's a few. I think that it's fair to say that we don't have as much data on what is an appropriate expectation in terms of metrics for a stewardship officer.
I would agree.
Okay, great. Eloise, I'll toss this one out to you. What is one of the most successful examples of stewardship that you have come across in your experiences dealing with a wide range of institutions?
Well, we probably covered it in the presentation today, and I'm going to speak generically because it's probably historic, but a stewardship program that again really takes into account the full individual and has enough sophistication to think about the ways in which the gift has impact throughout the year. So a program that does not just focus on the once-a-year stewardship report or when the gift comes in, but in fact is a fluid flow of information back and forth relative to the impact of the gift.
Great, and I think we have time for one or two more. Eloise, again, how do you measure the impact of stewardship?
Simply put, by how much money is continued to be raised. That may be too simplistic an answer and maybe doesn't take into account really what the nature of the question was, but that is the ultimate test. Are those donors who are in stewardship, do they continue to give? And do they move up the line in terms of giving more? It's their ultimate vote whether or not they want to continue to invest, and there are different ways to perhaps to footnote that, et cetera, or to qualify that, but essentially I think that may be the best measure, and the stewardship office should be pretty conscious about tracking that to see whether or not the donors are giving as a result of what have they been given from stewardship.
Okay, great. I think that brings us to the end of our time today. Again, I would just like to let our audience know that this coming Monday, I will send an email that has our presentation slide deck, the recording with the audio of today's presentation, as well as a short survey to gain your feedback. If you have any additional questions, feel free to contact Eloise, Mary Carroll, or myself. And we thank you again for your participation in today's webinar.